Hello and welcome again to Money Tips. This is Charles Kelly, bringing you money tips to help you save, earn, invest, accumulate and enjoy more money. Today I'm asking you a question. When is a freehold in effect not worth the paper it's written on? Or put another way, when is a freehold a bit like a leasehold? Now I'll be explaining a bit more, and I wouldn't say in this case it's really not worth the paper it's written on, but that's what some of the people are saying who have bought new build homes from a company called Persimmon in Pembroke in Wales. They bought the house but then found out that although it's a freehold, now with a freehold it means you own the land on which the house is built, so you'd expect that you can do what you like with it, it's yours, no one can tell you what to do, unlike a leasehold where you've got a landlord who owns the freehold, and you only have that house during the term of the lease, and then it goes back to the landlord. It's a bit of a feudal type of system, and so a lot of people avoid leaseholds because they don't want to be having a landlord over their back charging them service charges and ground rents, and it doesn't feel like the place is yours. Although you can get long leases, 997-year leases, that they're effectively like a freehold. There is also something called common hold, which is when people share the freehold. But, you'd expect if you're buying a house and it's freehold that, nobody can tell you what to do. However, there are situations when freeholds are not quite the same as when you buy a normal house and it's on a freehold. And that's when you've got things called covenants, or sometimes called restrictive covenants, on the title of your house, your deeds. And this is... Usually, you get some old properties that have got restrictive covenants, like they might have a footpath where you're going through it, or it might be some sort of shared land or shared driveways and that sort of thing. But these restrictive covenants are becoming more frequent now with a lot of new build estates going up, where there is a mixture of houses and flats. So you've got maybe 40 houses and a couple of hundred flats. And one of the companies here called Persimmon has been criticised. Now Persimmon is doing quite well as a company. They've done very well out of Help to Buy, and the directors took millions of pounds in dividends, and their share actually gives a dividend. If you buy one of their shares, you'll get a dividend of, I think, up to 12%. So that they've done very well for their shareholders, but some of the people who bought their properties are not so happy. And there's a story here in the BBC that Denise Sutherland bought her first new build home in Pembroke in 2016. She made sure it was a freehold. She didn't like landlords and leaseholds, so she would never get involved in a leasehold property. But now she's finding out that her freehold property has similar sort of restrictions to a leasehold property. And, as the years have gone on, she's finding these things out. Now, she used a solicitor, but that was recommended by the developer. But the solicitor is supposed to tell her that, these covenants exist. Now, maybe the solicitor did. Maybe he put it in a written report and she didn't read it. But she certainly didn't read all of her paperwork. But she says she's now finding out that there's more of a dozen restricted covenants placed on her home, limiting what she can and cannot do without it. Now, covenant is a legally binding agreement which is enforceable by a court. Now, something else she's worried about is her legal rights, which means that she could be evicted if she falls behind with the annual rent charge on her freehold. Now, this is quite unusual, isn't it? You don't expect to get an annual rent charge on your freehold because you, in effect, own the land, unlike a leasehold where, the freeholder or the landlord owns the land. So it's causing a bit of anxiety here, but I think there are reasons for it. I'll explain that in a second. Now, once the estate apparently hasn't finished, but they will be handed over to a management company, she will be charged service charges for the upkeep of the green spaces and maintenance of the roads, because a lot of these are private roads and private estates. But she doesn't have any control over how much rent is charged and what the increase might be in the future. She said, why weren't these explained to her in the beginning? And blah, blah, blah. She's not very happy. Now, what is this? I mean, basically, it's a covenant in place so that the householders who are freeholders and the leaseholders pay towards the upkeep of the grounds. Now, when you see these places, there's green spaces, there's roads to be upkept. They're on a private estate, so they're private roads perhaps. There's all sorts of things, and as well as keeping the place in some sort of order, and making sure that parking spaces perhaps are allocated properly and managed, and all these things. And that's what Persimmons say, that Persimmons say that covenants are intended to preserve the amenity and the outlook of the wider estate, and to provide a good neighbourly relationships when planning the estate. A developer will need to put these restrictive covenants in place so that this is, the places are maintained. I've lived on housing estates where this is not the case, and things can fall into a bit of disrepair. People can put up satellite dishes where they want, and it can make the place look scruffy and tardy. There's arguments over parking spaces, bins, and the houses using some of the bins that are intended for the flats. And you get some arguments unless things are managed properly. And parking is one of those, particularly in a city centre. But she's saying that she needs permission before she can build anything. I suppose if she wants to build a loft extension or an extension, and she has to pay them fees. So she's annoyed about that. And I can understand it, but if everyone could just do what they want, and you've got a nice estate newly built, and then people start doing what they want. I mean, there's an estate near me where they built houses with integral garages, and people wanted to convert them into a room rather than having a tiny garage. And there were covenants on those enforceable by the council, but that was eventually sorted out, and people are now just doing what they like. But it does change the look of the place when you've got garages, and then a room, and then garages. It's not quite the same, but most developers are not really worried about it after they've built it. Now, what's the remedy? They can do a right to manage. They can take over the management themselves. These are all of the, I think you might need 2/3 or something like that of the people to vote to do a right to manage, just as you can with a leasehold property. If you're in a leasehold block of flats and you're not happy with the way the managers are managing things and charging for it, you can get what's called a right to manage. You can do it yourselves, or there's companies that specialise in forming right to manage. And I've done these myself when I had a block of flats. We had a terrible manager that was just charging a fortune, the freeholder, really a rip-off freeholder that owned thousands of freeholds. So you can do what's called a right to manage and solve your problem that way. But just watch out for that if you're buying on some of these new estates, and also watch out for some of the unfair leases which have been criticised by the government with very high ground rents. Now, ground rents used to be £50, £100 a year, maybe going up every 20 years. Now you're getting ground rents of £300-400, even more ground rent, and they're going up every 5 years. In future years they'll be running into thousands of pounds. And people don't think about this when they buy. They just want to get in. They've got the help to buy. They're rushing. It's their first property. They're not really thinking ahead as to what these things could mean. Service charges can also be very expensive, particularly in properties with lifts and porters and concierges and that sort of thing. You are going to pay thousands of pounds in service charges. And if you're buying these as a buy-to-let, the landlord is usually saddled with the service charges and the ground rents and that sort of thing, and the council tax. So, you've got to charge quite a high rent to cover that. I mean, in some of the old mansion blocks, not ground rents, but the service charges can be £5,000 or more a year, because you've got gardens, you've got these nice gardens there, you've got porters and concierges and 24-hour concierge that can, hello sir, and all this. It's all very nice, but it's all got to be paid for, and so just watch out for that. That's why, as an investor, I try and avoid leasehold flats, because you haven't really got any control over charges and where it's going. I remember one flat where the windows were not very good, and I couldn't get hold of people, and in the end I just did the windows myself, as other people in the block did. And then I got a stroppy letter from the management company wanting £300 or £400 just to consider my request. In the end I told them where to go, but it could have ended up in a dispute. In the end I was a little bit lucky, because they sold off the freehold to another company, and they just dropped it. But it was just a bit of stress you didn't need, and that's why, as an investor, although you can get higher yields on flats in that You can buy, if you've got £500,000, or let's and you buy a house, the rent you'll get from that house will probably be less in yield terms than a rent you would get on a flat. Or for a similar rent, you could pay less for a flat to get a similar rent. But you've got problems with flats, in that people around you can cause problems. And a lot of people in a flat don't want to pay for the upkeep of the roof, and that's when they think they live on the ground floor. The roof is not their problem. Well, of course it's their problem. The roof is covering the whole house, not just the top flat. So, you can get into problems with flats. So I tend to avoid them, but they are a necessary part of the property world. Not everyone can afford a house. So that's a little bit about that. The word of the day is covenant. What is a covenant? It's not a place where nuns live, but little joke there. It does come from a sort of a biblical word, if you like, and it's just a formal agreement or a promise to pay a fixed amount regularly, especially in terms of like services or charities. You can have a covenant to pay. A church, for instance, you can covenant to pay X amount per year as a covenant. And sometimes churches have refused to let people out of these covenants, believe it or not. So just be careful when you see a word covenant. It can be a very binding kind of agreement. So that's the word of the day. A little bit of other news today. We've seen, last week I told you about house prices, that they'd slowed up to a 6-year low, and that was from a nationwide building society report. This has been confirmed now this week by another report from the Halifax, saying that house prices are rising at the slowest annual pace for more than 6 years. And they say that prices rose by 1.1% in the year to September. The other report from the nationwide said it was less than 1%, it was 0.2%. So there's not a lot of difference there. But generally, what I'm saying is the house price growth rate is very slow. Other news come out about student accommodation. Many landlords have bought houses to provide student accommodation, and then they're finding that companies are coming in, maybe in conjunction with universities, and building swanky new buildings right next to the university, and luxury accommodation, and landlords would find it difficult to compete with that because they've just got a house which is a HMO, not quite as new and brand spanking new and shiny with all ensuite facilities and that sort of thing as can be provided by these new companies. So it's kind of hit the market. Then of course you've got councils which put Article 4 restrictions, which mean that less houses can be turned into HMOs, or no further HMOs can be granted in a particular area around a university. This is to stop every house becoming a HMO. And so landlords have found it difficult when these companies have come in with a lot of big funding behind them and built swanky new places. However, some of these accommodation companies are running into problems. There's been a few that's gone broke, and now there's a company which is failing to finish the properties in time. And I can talk a little bit more about that tomorrow, but it might give you some hope if you're a small landlord providing to students. But I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, about student homes running into problems and causing problems where they're not ready. And of course, this is the time when students are arriving at universities and they're finding that these homes are still like a building site. Okay, so that's all for now. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in to all my friends on Facebook, on the Facebook Live, and to people on my podcast, which you can find on moneytipsdaily.com, or on iTunes and Stitcher. Hope you've had a good start to the week, and I will speak to you soon. Thanks very much.